When the rusty container was dropped on the edge of the Nevada desert, it didn't look like shelter. It looked like a coffin of steel, baking under the endless sun. But for Jack Turner and his loyal German Shepherd Scout, this was no tomb. It was a fortress. A veteran fleeing the ghosts of war, Jack thought silence would be his salvation. If he could lock the desert out, maybe he could lock his memories in. Yet on the very first night, as the heavy iron door boomed shut, he learned a terrifying truth. Silence isn't a cure, it's a mirror. And in that mirror waited not only the nightmares of combat, but something far stranger, an ancient secret buried beneath the desert sands. A secret Scout would soon dig up, one not of this earth. The Nevada desert in late autumn was a place stripped down to bone and silence, its vast plateaus scarred by wind and sun, its horizon endless, except for the jagged teeth of distant mountains. The air was dry enough to crack lips in an hour, the ground a quilt of pale dust and stone, scattered with sagebrush that clung to life as stubbornly as the coyotes that roamed by night. The sky stretched wide, so big and empty that it felt less like a roof and more like an invitation to vanish into eternity. Heat shimmered even in the cooler months, and when the wind blew it carried a sting, whispering like sandpaper across steel. It was here, on a barren patch of earth, far from paved roads or friendly towns, that Jack Turner chose to build what he called his sanctuary, though in truth it looked far more like a grave. Jack was 43 years old, a man carved out of war and hardship. His body was tall and lean with the wiry strength of someone who had carried packs and weapons through deserts on the other side of the world. His shoulders sloped slightly from years of weight, and his arms were knotted with muscle that spoke of endurance more than vanity. His face was angular, with a sharp jawline partly hidden beneath a short beard peppered with gray, a beard he trimmed with military precision. His hair, once a solid brown, was now streaked with silver, kept cropped close to his scalp as if long hair might invite chaos. His eyes, hazel with flecks of green, were deep-set and shadowed, eyes that had seen too much and carried it still. Those who met him sometimes found a quiet kindness there, but it was buried beneath layers of caution. Jack was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had burned his bridges and learned that words often brought others too close. Silence was his language now, and discipline his refuge. The event that had forged his silence still clawed at him in dreams. An explosion during his final deployment overseas, the roar of twisted metal, and the sudden loss of men under his command. Jack had walked away alive, but alive did not mean whole. The ghosts came back in helicopters that were not there, in the smell of cordite that wasn't real, in the sudden booms of thunder or trucks backfiring. Doctors called it PTSD, but to Jack, it was simply the price of survival. The debt you paid when your body returned from war, but your mind did not. He had tried city living afterward, but crowds pressed too close and noises too sharp. He had tried the suburbs, but even neighbors' friendly chatter was an invasion he couldn't afford. So he had come here, to the Nevada desert, to build a fortress out of steel and silence. The container that arrived on the back of a flatbed was 40 feet of dented green metal, its paint scarred from years at sea. To an outsider it looked like trash, a cast-off from the global shipping lanes, but to Jack it was perfect, a shell that kept the world out. He directed the driver to lower it onto a leveled patch of earth he had prepared with his own hands. The driver was a portly man with a sunburned face, a heavy beard streaked with oil and sweat, and eyes that looked tired but curious. "Road's hell out here," the man boomed, wiping his forehead. "Nearly lost her on that last turn." Jack simply nodded, handed over the signed paperwork and the last of his cash, and gave no answer. Conversation was another bridge he had no interest in building. The driver shrugged, muttered something under his breath, and left in a cloud of dust. Silence reclaimed the desert like a jealous lover. At Jack's side stood his partner in solitude, Scout, a 5-year-old German shepherd, large and strong with a coat that seemed to shimmer between silver, black, and white, depending on the angle of the light. Scout was a handsome dog, ears pointed like twin antennae, amber eyes intelligent and watchful. His chest was broad, his legs long and sturdy, and there was a certain stillness to him even when he moved. He did not fidget or bark without cause. He seemed to breathe calm into the air around him. He had been trained once, not in the military sense, but by Jack himself, who taught him hand signals and simple commands that bound them in a language of silence. Scout was not playful like other dogs. He did not chase shadows or howl at the moon, but his loyalty was absolute. He stayed close when Jack faltered, pressed his weight against Jack's leg when memories tried to drag him under. Scout was not just a pet. He was an anchor, the one steady presence in a life unmoored. Jack opened the container with a groaning creak of hinges, the inside smelling of salt and rust, a hollow cavern echoing his footsteps. He began unloading his truck, each motion precise, soldierly. A military cot unfolded and laid in the corner, a sleeping bag rolled tight against sub-zero nights, 6 blue barrels filled with fresh water, a camping stove, a chemical toilet. Everything had purpose, nothing sentimental. No photographs, no letters, no objects to tie him to a past he wanted erased. He arranged his small world with the discipline of setting up an outpost in hostile territory. Outside, Scout sat erect, ears twitching at the wind, his gaze scanning the horizon as though patrolling invisible perimeters. When evening fell, Jack ate cold beans from a can, while Scout crunched his kibble. The only light was from a storm lantern that painted the corrugated walls with dancing shadows. Outside, the wind rose and shrieked, circling the container with the mournful sound of 1,000 ghosts. Jack lay on his cot, the Beretta pistol he had carried through deployments resting by his side. He had promised himself he would not need it here, but old habits die slower than men. As the desert fell into silence, he discovered the cruel trick of solitude. It did not soothe him. It mirrored him. In the silence, the sounds he had buried came clawing back. The roar of an engine, the desperate shouting of men, the shriek of metal twisting under fire. He sat bolt upright, breath ragged, sweat dampening his temples, heart pounding as if the container itself were under attack. Then Scout moved, not with alarm, but with purpose, stepping forward to rest his heavy head on the edge of Jack's cot. His warm breath washed over Jack's hand, and Jack tangled his fingers into the thick fur. The dog whined softly, no judgment, no questions, only presence. Jack focused on that, on the steady rhythm of Scout's breathing, and little by little his own heartbeat slowed. The ghosts faded back into their dark corners, though they did not disappear. Jack lay back down, one hand still pressed into the fur of his companion, and listened. He listened to the wind clawing at steel, to Scout's calm breath, and to the frantic beat of his own heart as it returned, slowly, to normal. When dawn came, the desert was merciless and beautiful all at once. Sunlight shattered across the landscape, painting long shadows that stretched like black rivers. Jack rose, exhaustion written on his face, but his body driven by habit. He stepped outside with Scout at his heel and began the routine that had kept him alive in darker places. A perimeter walk, eyes scanning for tracks or disturbances, followed by push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups from the branch of a stunted mesquite. Each motion was deliberate, pushing his body until the burn silenced his mind. Scout received his own drills: stay, come, watch, obeying with fluid grace, their silent conversation a reminder of trust and purpose. By mid-morning, Jack stood before his steel fortress, the desert stretching empty in all directions. He had survived the first night, though not without battle. The silence was not salvation. It was trial. He knew the fight was not with coyotes or strangers, but with the prisoner that lived inside his own skull. Scout pressed against his leg, and Jack allowed a ghost of a smile. They would endure. This was their fortress, their exile, their war. The second morning in the Nevada desert arrived with a thin veil of chill before the sun climbed high enough to burn it away. Jack Turner had slept little, the cot inside his steel fortress more a place for vigilance than rest. Scout, his German shepherd companion, had dozed lightly at his side, waking at the faintest stir. As the desert yawned awake with the cries of distant ravens and the scratch of wind against mesquite branches, Jack shouldered his rucksack, checked his canteen, and stepped out into the brightness. He needed to know his land not by maps, but by the soles of his boots. If he could catalog every inch, every ridge and dry wash, then maybe the desert would stop feeling like an enemy and start becoming neutral ground. The land he had claimed was wide and uneven, scarred by years of flash floods and violent winds. Rock outcroppings jutted from the earth like half-buried skeletons, and sage spread in stubborn clusters. Jack moved with deliberate pace, eyes always scanning, his body a catalogue of old habits. His hands brushed the grit of stone, his boots kicked aside loose shale, and every so often he crouched to study tracks. Jackrabbit, coyote, once even a set of faint deer prints that seemed impossible in such a harsh land. Scout padded ahead, his coat flashing silver in the sunlight, his ears alert, tail held straight, like a flag of intent. He paused often, nose twitching at scents invisible to his master, before trotting back to heel at a sharp signal of Jack's hand. It was on the far western ridge, a place where the ground dropped toward a valley veined with cattle trails, that Jack first saw her. She was a figure bent over a fence post, her movements precise and repetitive, driving metal into wood with the swing of a heavy hammer. Jack froze instinctively, body sinking into the shadow of a rock outcrop. Observation came first. Contact, never. Through the glare of the sun, he measured the stranger. The woman was perhaps in her late 30s, with the build of someone whose strength was earned not in gyms, but in fields. She was tall, shoulders squared, her frame sturdy rather than slender, every motion honed by repetition and necessity. Her hair, a dark brown, was pulled back tightly into a ponytail that kept it out of her face, though loose strands clung to her temples in the heat. Her skin was weathered, tanned by years of desert sun, the kind of complexion that told you she belonged to the land and not to office walls. Even from a distance, Jack could sense the blunt practicality in her posture. She worked without hesitation, without wasted motion, as though the land itself demanded efficiency. She wore a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans scuffed at the knees, and boots coated with dust and wear. A wide-brimmed hat lay on the ground nearby, discarded while she labored. Jack's training warned him about variables,
uncontrolled elements in an otherwise predictable environment. And this woman was now a variable.
He had chosen this patch of desert for its isolation, its promise of silence. But here she was, proof that even silence had boundaries. Scout froze as well, ears pricked, gaze locked on the figure. Jack raised a hand, calming him into stillness. The woman straightened suddenly, hand still resting on the fence post. She did not move because of sound. Jack had made none. It was something else, a prickling instinct, the awareness that she was being observed. Her head turned, her posture tightening. From across the valley, Jack felt her eyes sweep the ridgeline with sharp focus. He held his breath, body rigid in the shadow. Scout did not move, though the dog's muscles quivered with contained energy. The woman stood like that for a full minute, statue still, gaze fixed toward his hiding place. Then with a slight shake of her head, she returned to her work. But her rhythm had shifted. Her hammer strikes carried a new caution. Her movements no longer relaxed. Jack noted the change, recognized it as the body language of someone who had grown used to vigilance. This was no careless rancher. She was as guarded as he was. Jack remained in his cover until the sun began to slide toward afternoon. Only then did he retreat, circling back across his land, with Scout moving silently at his side. His mind turned over the details like puzzle pieces. A ranch to the west, a woman who worked alone, strength in her frame, caution in her manner. He remembered the hat on the ground, the way she had looked up with certainty, not confusion. She had sensed him the way soldiers sense eyes on their back. That kind of awareness wasn't born of ease, but of long practice. Back at the container, Jack tried to focus on tasks, rigging a tarp for shade, organizing tools, mapping water rations. But every time his gaze lifted to the ridge, he thought of her. The desert was wide, but not empty. His fortress had neighbors. That night, the desert stretched quiet again, but the quiet carried new weight. Jack lay awake, listening to the wind drum its restless fingers on steel walls. Scout shifted closer, his amber eyes reflecting the lantern glow before settling shut. Jack reached down, resting a hand on the dog's fur, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the image of the woman with the hammer. In his years of running from people, he had not expected that the first person he'd encounter out here would mirror his own caution so perfectly. He did not know her name yet, but the desert had already written the introduction. Maggie Hart, a solitary sentinel of her own land, as rooted to the valley as Jack was trying to root himself to the ridge. He had no intention of crossing her fence, no intention of exchanging words, but already an invisible line stretched between them, thin, taut, humming with unspoken recognition. It was the beginning of a relationship not forged by speech, but by distance, respect, and the wary silence of two souls who understood the value of boundaries. The desert accepted the shift without fanfare. Coyotes cried in the distance, stars burned clean above, and two neighbors on opposite ridges continued their separate vigils, both knowing that silence had changed its shape. The Nevada sun had no gentleness, so they be hammering down on the ridges and valleys until the rocks themselves seemed to radiate heat like coals. Jack Turner moved across his land with the steady pace of a man used to marching long miles, a canteen at his hip, and his German shepherd Scout loping ahead. The second day had taught him that silence was not absence. It was layers, wind brushing sand, distant cries of hawks, the crunch of boots against gravel. He was cataloging his terrain, memorizing every contour. If he was to survive here, He had to know this land the way he once knew maps of hostile countries, with precision and instinct. It was near the western boundary, past a scatter of mesquite and brittle sage, that the ground fell into a shallow depression, littered with rusted timbers and half-buried rocks. Jack recognized the look instantly, an old mine shaft, long abandoned, the earth collapsing in on itself. The timbers were blackened and warped, leaning like broken ribs, the opening a dark maw that exhaled stale air into the desert. Scout paused at the edge, ears high, tail stiff. He took a cautious step forward, nose twitching, then froze, a low growl humming in his chest. Jack moved closer, his hand instinctively brushing against the grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Scout did not relax. Instead, he stepped stiffly toward a patch of dirt, just beyond the rotten timbers. Then he began to dig. His front paws slashed at the dry earth with furious energy, claws sending up sprays of sand and stones. Jack frowned. He had seen Scout dig before, after rodents or curious scents. But this was different. There was no play in the movement, no hesitation. It was frantic, obsessed, as though the dog were following a command only he could hear. "Scout, heel." Jack's tone carried the authority of habit. The dog ignored him, dirt flying in desperate arcs. For the first time since they'd been together, Scout disobeyed. That sent a cold knot into Jack's stomach. He crouched, watching, suspicion gnawing at his instincts. Then, with a final grunt, Scout shoved his muzzle deep into the hole and emerged with something clenched gently in his jaws. He patted back to Jack, tail low but wagging in subtle triumph, and dropped the object at his master's boots. It was a small leather pouch, so old the hide had darkened to near black, its surface cracked, edges brittle. The stitching had rotted in places, the smell of earth and age rising from it. Jack knelt, turning it over with careful hands, his combat engineer's precision returning as if he were defusing a mine. The pouch was surprisingly heavy. He eased open the flap. Inside, nestled in crumbling lining, was a silver locket. Time had darkened it with tarnish, the once bright surface dulled to a lifeless gray. Yet even through the grime, he could see an engraving on the front, a looping letter, A. Jack felt a strange twinge in his chest. He rubbed his thumb over the metal, dislodging a thin layer of dirt, and on the reverse side he found more, letters so small they seemed carved with painstaking care. Amy, Aug. 1978. For a long moment, Jack crouched in the desert silence, the object lying cold in his palm. Scout sat beside him, tongue lolling, watching with those amber eyes that seemed too knowing. "What did you dig up, boy?" Jack muttered. There was no answer but a short whine. The locket was old, clearly decades. The name etched into it struck him. Amy. He thought of Maggie Hart, the neighbor he had glimpsed yesterday, her dark hair tied back, her wary eyes scanning the ridge as if she could feel his presence. Could it be coincidence? The initial A, the name Amy, the year that felt like a ghost from a different lifetime? Jack shook the thought from his mind. Coincidence or not, the desert had just delivered him a relic, and relics were never harmless. That night, inside the container, Jack set the locket on the makeshift table he had built from salvaged planks. The storm lantern flickered, casting the silver into alternating light and shadow. Scout lay curled by the cot, his breathing slow, though his ears twitched at every sound. Jack ate a sparse dinner, his gaze never leaving the oval of metal. When the desert finally stilled and silence wrapped tight around the container, Jack heard it. At first he thought it was his imagination, the echo of wind in steel. But then it came again, a faint hum, so low it vibrated more in his teeth than his ears. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The sound was not random. It pulsed, rhythmic, almost like a machine at rest. The locket, sitting on bare wood, was the source. Jack reached out, pressing his fingertips to the tarnished surface. The hum deepened, a vibration running up his arm into his bones. His chest tightened, breath hitching. He jerked his hand back, and the sound faded, retreating into the silence. Scout stirred, lifting his head, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light. The dog whined, uneasy, then rose and pressed close to Jack's leg, his body warm and solid. Jack sat there, heart hammering, staring at the piece of silver. He had fought wars where machines screamed and men died in seconds. He had seen weapons hidden in toys, explosives disguised as harmless cans. But this was different. This was not a bomb. It was a whisper, a signal, something that did not belong to Earth's silence. Sleep did not come easily. Jack lay awake, Scout pressed at his side, the desert night thick with unbroken dark. His mind turned over possibilities like an old rifle bolt. Was this trinket connected to the mine? To the land itself? To his neighbor, whose caution mirrored his own? And why did his dog, his steady anchor, dig it up with such insistence? When dawn burned across the Nevada horizon, Jack sat at the small table again, the locket between his fingers. It no longer hummed in daylight, no longer throbbed with strange energy. Yet its presence lingered like a weight in the room, an intrusion into his fortress of steel. He turned it over, studying the engraving once more. Amy, Aug. 1978. The desert had given him silence. Now it had given him a voice inside that silence. Jack Turner, who had come here to bury his own ghosts, now held a ghost that was not his. And ghosts, he knew, never stayed buried. The desert sun burned white over Sparrow Creek, the small town lying like a stubborn outpost in the Nevada wasteland. Its single main street carried the tired look of survival rather than prosperity. Faded wooden facades leaned into each other as if for support, paint blistered under decades of heat. A gas station stood near the corner, its rusted sign swinging lazily in the breeze, while across the street the Sparrow Creek hardware and supply slumped under the weight of years, its windows clouded with dust. Jack Turner guided his old truck down the road, Scout riding silently in the passenger seat. The dog's ears twitched, scanning the unfamiliar sounds, children calling in the distance, a hammer echoing from a workshop, the faint strains of country music laking from the tavern. Jack parked under the shade of a cottonwood tree and stepped out, his boots raising a puff of red dust. His broad frame and the hard lines of his face drew a few curious glances from locals, but no one spoke. He pushed open the door of the hardware store, a small bell chiming overhead. The smell inside was sharp with oil and sawdust, and behind the counter stood Ruth Ellison. Ruth was in her early 60s, tall and lean with shoulders still square from years of lifting crates heavier than most men cared to handle. Her hair, once fiery red, had dulled to a copper gray, tied back in a braid that fell to the middle of her back. Deep lines etched her face, carved by sun and loss, but her eyes, clear blue, steady, carried the kind of gaze that measured people instantly. She wore a denim shirt, rolled at the sleeves, heavy canvas trousers, and a belt, with a tooled buckle scuffed from decades of use. Ruth had the look of someone who had outlived both hardship and gossip, a woman who didn't give her trust easily, but guarded fiercely once given. Jack placed the tarnished silver locket on the counter. It gleamed faintly under the weak light. Ruth's eyes widened, her hand stilled on the rag she had been using to wipe the surface. She leaned closer, her brow furrowing as if struck by memory. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "On my land," Jack replied. His voice was hoarse, a man who had spent too long in silence. "Near the old mine." Ruth's face tightened, and she touched the locket with careful fingers. "I haven't seen this in 40 years. She turned it over, her thumb brushing across the inscription. "Amy, Aug. 1978. Her breath caught, and she looked at Jack, suspicion mingled with recognition. "You don't know what you've walked into, do you?" Jack said nothing, only waited. Scout sat close by, steady, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ruth. She sighed, her shoulders settling as though bracing against a burden long carried. It was the summer of 78. Ruth began, her gaze drifting not at Jack, but into some distance only she could see. Strange things had been happening for weeks. Lights in the sky, silent, but bright, dancing above the ridges at night. People said it was Air Force testing, but we knew better. We felt it in our bones. She paused, swallowing. Maggie Hart's cousin, Amy Garrett, was 16 then. Tall, wiry girl, dark blonde hair, skin tanned from working the ranch. She was curious, braver than most, always chasing stories. One night, she went out toward that mine, after folks claimed the lights had hovered above it. She never came back. Ruth's voice lowered to a near whisper. Search parties scoured the desert for weeks. Sheriff's men, ranchers, volunteers. They found nothing but Amy's scarf caught on a fence post, flapping in the wind. No tracks, no sign of struggle, nothing human could explain. And then, just like that, the lights stopped. The desert went quiet again, but not in a way that brought peace, in a way that felt like something had been taken. Jack's jaw tightened. He glanced down at the locket. "And this?" Ruth exhaled, her hands closing over the small piece of silver. "It belonged to Amy. Her father gave it to her for her 16th birthday. Folks thought it was gone with her." She pushed it back toward him. "If Scout dug this up near that mine, then the desert's still talking. And when the desert talks, Mr. Turner, you'd better listen." Jack slid the locket back into his pocket. The weight of it seemed heavier than steel. He gave Ruth a short nod, turned, and walked out without another word. Scout trotted close to his heel, silent as always. The drive back to his land was quiet, but Jack's thoughts churned like a storm. Amy Garrett, cousin to Maggie Hart, had vanished in a blaze of strange lights before he ever set foot in Nevada. And now, decades later, her locket had resurfaced in his hands. It was no longer just an artifact. It was a wound, reopened in metal and memory. As the sun bled low over the desert, Jack pulled up near Maggie's ranch. He stopped the truck before the gate, its barbed wire stretching out like a warning line. Scout shifted in the passenger seat, watching him intently. Jack held the locket in his palm, staring at the engraved A. His instincts screamed to bury it, to erase the connection. Yet something deeper, some soldier's code of duty, told him otherwise. Lost things deserved to be returned. He climbed out, boots crunching over gravel. Maggie's house stood in the distance, a modest ranch home, weathered but sturdy. The barn loomed nearby, shadows stretching long. He didn't approach. He didn't call out. Instead, he walked to the gatepost and placed the locket carefully on the wood, its silver surface catching the last light of the dying sun. Then he turned and walked back to the truck, never glancing behind. From the porch, Maggie Hart had seen him. She stood motionless, her arms crossed against the evening chill, Her frame was lean, built from years of labor, her dark brown hair tied back as always, her sun-bronzed skin etched with lines of endurance. Tonight, however, her sharp blue eyes were not guarded with suspicion, but frozen in something else. Shock, grief, recognition. When Jack's truck rolled away in a cloud of dust, she moved toward the gate, her boots leaving faint prints in the sand. Her hand trembled as she lifted the locket. She turned it over, her breath catching at the familiar engraving. The world around her seemed to fall away, leaving only the cold metal in her palm. The desert, silent as ever, seemed to hum faintly, as if the locket carried not just memory but a pulse, an echo of something that had never left. The night air thickened, charged with an invisible weight, and above the horizon, too faint for Jack to see, a flicker of light danced briefly across the sky before vanishing into the stars. The Nevada desert was a place of contradictions. By day, it baked everything under a merciless sun, but by night, winter storms rolled off the distant mountains with the force of siege engines. That evening, clouds gathered heavy and purple on the horizon, dragging the temperature down as a sharp wind carved through the valley. Jack Turner stood outside his shipping container, his coat pulled tight across his lean frame, Scout pressed close against his leg. The dog's thick coat, silver and black, bristled as if he sensed what was coming. Jack squinted at the horizon, instincts honed in another kind of battlefield whispering of danger. The storm struck after midnight. Snow came sideways, hurled by winds that howled like artillery across the barren ridge. The steel container shuddered with each blast, its seams rattling, and the cold seeped through with relentless patience. Jack had prepared for silence, for solitude, but not for this fury. His small propane heater flickered, sputtered, and died, the flame choking against the freezing line. Breath plumed in white clouds, each inhale stabbing his lungs. Scout curled tightly against him on the cot, his warm body a shield against the growing cold. Jack pulled every layer of clothing he owned around them both, but the steel walls felt like an icebox. Memories clawed at him. Nights in Afghanistan, when desert winds turned bitter, and frostbite gnawed at men unprepared. He had seen soldiers freeze, not from lack of courage, but from lack of heat. He clenched his jaw, whispering to himself, "Not tonight." Across the valley, Maggie Hart stood at the window of her ranch house. The storm clawed at her walls, snow piling against the porch, yet her gaze was fixed on the faint outline of Jack's container, nearly invisible in the blizzard. Maggie was in her late 30s, tall, her shoulders strong from years of hauling hay and repairing fences alone. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid, her sun-bronzed skin now pale in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. She had the bearing of someone who rarely asked for help, but tonight her jaw tightened with worry. She knew what the storm could do. She had lost cattle before in sudden freezes, had once nearly frozen herself after being thrown from a horse during a winter ride. She told herself it wasn't her problem. Jack Turner was a recluse, a stranger. Yet she also knew he was a veteran, living alone in a steel box with only his dog for company. Maggie made her decision with the same resolve she used to mend fences or face down creditors. She pulled on her heavy coat, lined with sheepskin, shoved her feet into worn leather boots, and wrestled a kerosene heater and a 5-gallon can of fuel from her barn. The effort strained her sturdy frame, but she moved with determination, her breath fogging in the frigid air. She drove her battered pickup across the valley, the headlights carving tunnels through the white chaos, tires slipping in drifts. At Jack's gate, she left the engine running, the heater and fuel set carefully by the container's door. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just left them where he could not miss them. Then she turned back into the storm, vanishing into the whiteout like a phantom. Jack discovered the offering at dawn. He had forced the container door open against the weight of snow, his breath ragged in the brittle air. There, sitting against the steel wall, was salvation in the shape of a heater and fuel can. He froze, his chest tightening. There was only one person who could have left it. He stared for a long moment, emotions conflicting, shame at his unpreparedness, relief at the reprieve, and a strange, unwelcome warmth that wasn't from the heater itself. Scout sniffed the metal, tail wagging gently, as if he understood the gift. Jack carried the heater inside, lit the flame, and soon the container filled with the hiss and glow of heat. For the first time in hours, his body loosened, the deep chill driven back. Yet his mind remained restless. He owed a debt now, and debts demanded payment. That afternoon, when the storm had broken and the sun glared down on snowfields sparkling like crushed glass, Jack saw Maggie struggling near her barn. She was bent over the well pump, a critical lifeline for her livestock, cursing under her breath as she wrestled with a wrench. Even from a distance, he could see her frustration in the set of her shoulders. Jack watched for a moment, then retrieved his toolkit, an old military-grade box, its contents arranged with meticulous precision. He walked across the snow, his boots crunching in the silence. Maggie looked up as he approached, her face guarded, blue eyes sharp. She straightened, crossing her arms over her denim jacket, wary but not hostile. Jack didn't speak. He simply pointed at the pump, then at his toolkit, raising an eyebrow in silent question. For a long second, Maggie held his gaze. Then she gave a curt nod. For the next hour, Jack worked with quiet, focused intensity. He disassembled the frozen pump, his strong hands steady even in the biting cold. His movements were economical, practiced, each bolt loosened, each valve inspected with the eye of an engineer who had once kept men alive by fixing failing machines under fire. Maggie stood nearby, watching, her suspicion melting slowly into reluctant respect. Scout sat at the edge of the scene, ears pricked, a loyal sentry in the snow. Finally, Jack replaced a cracked valve, reassembled the housing, and flipped the breaker. The pump sputtered, then roared to life, water gushing into the trough. Maggie's lips parted in relief, though she said nothing. Jack closed his toolkit, gave her a brief nod, the same measured gesture with which she had acknowledged him at the gate, and turned to leave. Maggie watched him walk back across the snow, Scout at his heel, the bond between them visible in every step. She didn't call after him. She didn't need to. That evening, as Jack sat by the heater Maggie had given him, Scout stretched on the floor, tail thumping softly. The silence of the desert had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a bridge of unspoken acts. One heater in the snow, one repaired pump. Survival traded back and forth like currency. Jack sipped his coffee, staring into the glow of the heater. The ghosts of war still pressed at the edges of his mind, but for the first time in years, he felt something else threading through the silence. Trust, fragile, tentative, but alive. The desert night was cold and clear, the stars glittering like shards of broken glass strewn across black velvet. Jack Turner sat at the rough wooden table inside his container, the kerosene lamp throwing a circle of yellow light. The silver locket lay open before him, its hinge creaking faintly whenever he moved it. Scout lay near the door, head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every outside sound. Jack had studied the locket a dozen times since finding it, but tonight he noticed something new. The inner surface of the silver, beneath the place where a photograph had once been, caught the lamplight at a strange angle. The gleam was not random. It shimmered with faint, etched lines too regular to be scratches. He fetched a magnifying lens from his toolkit and leaned close. The marks resolved into something unmistakable, a strip of microfilm embedded in the thin layer of silver, so small it could easily have been overlooked. The film glowed faintly, not like ordinary light, but with a phosphorescent sheen that seemed alive. Jack's breath caught in his throat. This was not human craftsmanship. With careful hands, he teased the film out, using the tip of his knife. The strip was no bigger than his thumb, etched with symbols, circles within circles, angular shapes intersecting at impossible angles. He frowned. They looked like coordinates, but not written in any format he recognized. His years in the military had taught him to read maps, grids, and coded signals. This was none of those. The symbols seemed to twist even as he looked at them, as though the geometry itself resisted comprehension. The only place he knew to turn was the one person bound to the story, Maggie Hart. At dusk, the next day, Jack walked to her ranch, Scout trailing silently. Maggie met him near the fence line. She wore a heavy canvas coat, her dark hair braided and pulled over one shoulder, her boots half buried in the snowdrifts left from the storm. Her sharp blue eyes regarded him warily but without hostility. Jack didn't waste words. He opened his palm to reveal the strip of film. It was inside the locket, he said simply. Maggie's expression faltered. She stepped closer, the cold air clouding between them. She studied the etchings, her brows drawing tight. "What is it?" "Coordinates," Jack replied, "but not ours." They went inside her barn for shelter from the wind. It smelled of hay and leather, the warm musk of horses lingering in the air. Maggie lit a lantern, the light casting long shadows across the beams. She perched on an overturned feed bucket, her posture tense but curious. Jack laid the strip flat on a wooden crate. Together they studied it, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the lantern's light. Maggie finally spoke. "My cousin Amy disappeared out by the mine. But the cemetery—" She hesitated, her hands clenching. "My family's buried there. If this film ties both places together." Her voice cracked, and she stopped. Scout stirred, his body tense, ears pricked. Jack followed the dog's gaze toward the small window of the barn. Outside, the stars seemed brighter than before, pulsing faintly. The hum began then, a low vibration that rolled through the ground, through their bones. It was coming from the direction of Jack's container. They hurried across the snow, Scout leading, his breath steaming in the frigid air. The container loomed like a shadowed monolith against the desert floor. As they approached, the hum intensified, a steady resonance that rattled the steel walls. Jack pushed the heavy door open, and the sound deepened into a bass note that vibrated the air itself. The locket, left on the table, was glowing softly, the etched film alive with light. Maggie's breath caught. "It's answering something," she whispered. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Or calling." The air inside the container shimmered faintly, shapes forming in the lantern light. For an instant, they both saw it, geometry unfolding, patterns not meant for human sight. Circles intersected at impossible angles, planes curved where space should not bend. The shapes hovered like living blueprints, drawn in lines of pure white light. Scout growled low, his body pressed against Jack's leg, yet he did not retreat. His amber eyes reflected the alien glow. Jack reached toward the projection, his hand trembling despite himself. The lines shifted as if aware of him, rearranging into two distinct markers, one aligned with the ridge where the abandoned mine gaped like a wound. The other stretched eastward, toward the faint silhouette of Sparrow Creek's graveyard. Maggie swallowed hard. The mine and the cemetery. Her voice shook. That's where it wants us to look. The shapes collapsed suddenly, the glow fading, leaving only the hum reverberating through the steel walls. Jack shut the locket, and the sound ceased, silence rushing back in like a tide. The two of them stood breathing hard, the echoes of impossible geometry still lingering in their minds. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. Whatever happened to Amy, it wasn't just disappearance, it was this. Her hands shook, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination. I don't know what you've brought back, Jack Turner, but it's not finished with us yet. Jack glanced down at Scout, who leaned against him, steady as ever. The dog's presence grounded him, even in the face of a reality unraveling. He looked back at Maggie. Then we find out, he said. His voice was steady, a soldier's vow. Outside, above the frozen desert, the stars pulsed faintly, as if answering. The Nevada desert shifted in small, imperceptible ways. Jack Turner, who had lived enough years watching for subtle signs of ambush or disaster, noticed them first. His compass, once twitchy and erratic near the mine, now held steady. The small battery-powered radio he used for weather reports, often filled with static, spoke with clear precision, its voice sharp in the cold air. Even Scout, his loyal German shepherd, seemed to sense the change. The 5-year-old dog, silver-black coat gleaming in the winter sun, no longer whined at night or stiffened at unseen disturbances. Instead, he carried himself with the calm of a sentry who knew his post was secure. Jack stood outside his container, shovel in hand, surveying the valley. The snow had melted into patches, leaving dark earth ready to be reshaped. He had endured the storm, endured the humming geometry that haunted his nights. And yet now the silence seemed different. Not oppressive, not a mirror of ghosts, but alive, charged, as if the valley itself breathed with him. For the first time since arriving, Jack began to build. The work was slow but steady. He framed out an extension with scavenged timbers, measuring cuts with the precision of a soldier laying mines, every angle exact, every nail driven as if it held back chaos itself. He cut an opening for a real window, installing one of the salvaged panes he had bartered in town. Light spilled inside his steel walls, chasing away the permanent dusk. A small porch took shape at the entrance, big enough for 2 chairs and a stack of firewood. Scout often lay there, chin on paws, watching his master with amber eyes, as if approving the transformation from fortress to home. Maggie Hart began to appear more often, though never with fanfare. She was a woman of 38, tall and strong, her lean frame shaped by years of labor. Her dark hair, usually tied back, sometimes escaped into loose strands that the wind teased across her sun-browned face. Her blue eyes, once guarded, now carried something quieter when she looked at Jack. Not trust exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement of another survivor. She brought things without asking, bundles of fence wire, sacks of feed, a stack of cut boards, left at his gate. When Jack returned the gesture, dropping off split firewood or buckets of fresh water, no words were exchanged, only nods, small gestures of acceptance. The rhythm of these silent trades stitched an invisible line between their worlds. One neither dared cross openly, but both relied upon. One morning, Jack found her near his fence, struggling with a stubborn post that refused to hold. Her breath steamed in the cold air, sweat dampening the collar of her denim jacket. Without speaking, Jack crossed the line, hefted the post with wiry strength, and hammered it into place. Maggie's lips twitched, almost a smile, though she masked it quickly. "Thanks," she muttered, her voice low, rough with a lifetime of working alone. Jack only nodded, brushing dirt from his calloused hands. Scout wagged his tail once, sensing a small bridge had been crossed. As days passed, Jack noticed how Maggie's presence filled silences differently than his dog's. With Scout, silence was comfort, the wordless trust of man and animal. With Maggie, silence carried weight, layered with the unspoken knowledge of shared burdens. She had lived through her cousin's disappearance, years of whispers, endless toil to hold her ranch together. He had lived through war, loss, and the crushing quiet of memories that refused to stay buried. Neither asked about the other's scars, but both recognized them. At night, the container sometimes hummed again, faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Jack would sit on the porch, Scout pressed against his boots, staring at the dark ridge where the mine slumbered. The stars above glittered, geometry hidden within their patterns, but no ship descended, no beacon split the sky. The mystery lingered, but it did not crush him anymore. It had become part of the valley, woven into the air and soil. One evening, Maggie joined him on the porch. She carried 2 mugs of steaming coffee, her hands rough but steady. She handed one to Jack without a word, sat in the other chair, and exhaled a long sigh. Scout lay between them, tail brushing both their boots as if to bridge the gap. The 3 of them sat together, watching the desert bleed into twilight. Maggie finally spoke, her voice quiet. "People in town still talk about Amy. They think she's gone, just a girl who wandered too far. But after what I saw in your container, I don't know anymore." Her hands tightened around her mug. "I'm not asking for answers, just don't let me face this valley alone." Jack's hazel eyes, deep set and shadowed, turned to her. He didn't promise words. He had too few left to give. Instead, he nodded once, a vow carried not in language, but in presence. Scout lifted his head, his ears flicking, as though sealing the pact. The valley had changed them all. Jack no longer sought only silence. He had found respect, survival, and something rarer still. A fragile alliance born not of love, but of wonder, of 2 people and a dog sharing a mystery that stretched beyond the stars. The desert night clung close as Jack Turner, Maggie Hart, and Scout made their way toward Sparrow Creek Cemetery. The graveyard sat on the edge of town, where sagebrush thinned and stone markers jutted from the earth like broken teeth. It had stood for more than a century, a resting place for miners, ranchers, and families who had weathered the Nevada sun. Jack carried a lantern in one hand, his pistol at his hip, while Maggie shouldered a canvas pack filled with rope, a crowbar, and bottled water. Scout padded silently ahead, his nose low to the ground, his ears flicking at every rustle of the wind. The coordinates from the locket had been clear once they overlaid them on a map. One marker pointed directly to the abandoned mine, but the second intersected with the cemetery's north edge, where a cluster of old gravestones leaned against one another like weary sentinels. Jack had spent days reconciling the angles, checking compass bearings, even walking the grid by foot. The result was undeniable. Something was buried under the soil of Sparrow Creek's dead. They arrived near midnight, the iron gate creaking softly as Jack pushed it open. Snow dusted the ground, glowing faintly under a thin moon. The graves lay silent, names worn by time, McAllister, Hayes, Ellison, families that had built and buried Sparrow Creek. Maggie's face tightened as they passed one stone in particular, Garrett. Amy's name wasn't carved there, but her family's was, and the absence weighed heavier than presence. At the far edge of the cemetery, where the ground sloped toward a dry wash, Scout stopped abruptly. He whined once, then began pawing at the soil between two weathered stones. Jack crouched beside him, lantern light revealing a patch where the snow melted faster than the surrounding earth. The ground here was disturbed, faint depressions visible if one knew how to look. He ran his hand across it. It vibrated faintly, like the hum from the container. "This is it," Jack murmured. Maggie dropped her pack and pulled free the crowbar. Her breath came fast, fogging in the night. "Then we'd dig." The work was grueling, each shovel bite cutting into frozen soil. Scout scratched alongside them, dirt flying under his strong paws. The deeper they went, the more the earth seemed unnatural, packed in layers as though placed deliberately. Finally, with a hollow clang, Jack's shovel struck something solid. He and Maggie cleared it together, revealing a rectangular slab of iron, its surface pitted with rust, but etched with faint geometric patterns glowing under the lantern. A hatch. Jack ran his fingers over the grooves. They weren't letters, but shapes, circles intersecting at impossible angles, echoes of the geometry from the locket's film. Maggie knelt beside him, her blue eyes wide, reflecting both fear and awe. "This isn't just old," she whispered. "This isn't from here." With effort, they pried the hatch open. A rush of stale, cold air burst upward, carrying the metallic tang of something sealed away for decades. The opening gaped like a wound, a black square descending into earth. Jack tied off a rope to a gravestone, testing the knot, then slung the lantern around his neck. "Stay close," he said quietly. Maggie tightened her coat, nodded once, and followed. Scout leapt in after them without hesitation, his claws clicking on the iron rungs of a ladder that led down into darkness. The chamber beneath was vast, carved with a precision no miner's hand could claim. The walls curved smoothly, lined with a strange metal that reflected their lantern's glow in muted silver. Dust lay thick, untouched by time, and at the chamber's center, half buried in stone, loomed the outline of a vessel. It was immense, 30 feet across, its hull a seamless dark material that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Its shape defied simple description, neither circular nor angular, but a fusion of both, geometry bent in ways that unsettled the eye. Strange symbols traced along its surface, glowing faintly like embers long dormant. Maggie's breath shuddered out of her. Dear God. Jack stepped closer, every instinct warring with disbelief. His life had been built on things tangible, rifles, sandbags, enemies you could see. But this was a warship of a different battlefield. He reached out and pressed his palm against the hull. The surface was warm, faintly alive beneath his hand. The hum surged instantly, filling the chamber like the heartbeat of the earth. Scout barked once, sharp and loud, the sound swallowed by the vastness. The vessel responded. Panels along the hull flickered, light pulsing outward in concentric rings. The geometry from the locket bloomed across the chamber walls, lines of pure light, mapping star patterns Jack did not recognize. The symbols converged on one point, echoing the ridge where the mine lay, then spiraled outward into constellations beyond human charts. Maggie stood frozen, her face pale under the glow, but her voice was steady. "Amy, she didn't vanish. She was taken." Jack pulled his hand back, the light dimming, his heart hammered, not from fear but from the weight of truth pressing in. The coordinates had not been a riddle, they had been a key, and Sparrow Creek Cemetery was not just a place of the dead. It was a doorway to something beyond Earth. They stood together in silence, 3 living beings before a ship that should not exist. Scout pressed against Jack's leg, tail low, amber eyes fixed on the glowing hull as though he, too, understood the enormity. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice rough, grounded in the soldier's pragmatism that had carried him through every battle. This changes everything. For you, for me, for this whole damn town. Maggie lifted her chin, her jaw firm despite the tremor in her hands. Then we protect it. Whatever this is, it's ours to face. Jack nodded slowly, lantern light casting hard, lines across his scarred face. The ghosts of war had driven him here seeking silence, but instead the desert had given him a mystery bound to the stars. And now, for the first time, he did not face it alone. Above them, the cemetery lay quiet, gravestones watching as they always had. Yet beneath the soil, Sparrow Creek carried a secret older and stranger than any name carved in stone. The chamber beneath Sparrow Creek Cemetery pulsed with light, the dormant vessel now awakened by Jack Turner's touch. The air shimmered with silent energy, and the strange hull exhaled warmth like a living thing. Jack, Maggie, and Scout stood together, lantern light forgotten, their eyes fixed on the ship's illuminated surface. The symbols shifted again, coalescing into patterns that spread across the curved walls. Unlike before, the geometry unfolded into a sequence resembling language, lines of light, converging into symbols they could almost read. Maggie clutched Jack's arm, her voice tight with awe. "It's trying to speak." Jack stepped forward, resting a scarred hand against the panel. His heartbeat hammered in his chest, but his voice was steady. "If it's a signal, let's hear it." The hum deepened, resonating through the floor, and a beam of pale blue light spilled outward. Within it flickered an image, not sharp, but real enough to take their breath away. A young woman stood there, her figure translucent, as though carried across impossible distance. She was slender, with dark blonde hair braided loosely over one shoulder, her skin radiant, her eyes alive with joy. "Amy," Maggie whispered. Her knees buckled, but she steadied herself, tears burning her eyes. The image smiled, warm and unafraid. When her voice came, it was clear, carried not through sound, but directly into their minds, soft and melodic. "Maggie, you found it. You found me." Jack froze, his soldier's mind grasping for logic, but Scout bounded forward, barking joyfully at the image. The figure bent as if to greet him, her hand shimmering as it passed through light. Maggie's breath came in broken sobs. "Amy, we thought you were dead. We buried you 1,000 times in our hearts." "No," Amy's voice soothed. "The night I vanished, it wasn't death. Another ship came. They took me, not in cruelty, but in invitation. They showed me a place beyond these skies, a world where silence is not emptiness, but music, where light itself is alive. I have lived there since, and I am happy, free." Jack swallowed hard. "And this ship?" Amy's image glanced toward the vessel around them, as though aware of it even across the void. "Not the one that carried me. This one was left behind long before, hidden beneath your earth. It is a bridge, a doorway. Through it, I can reach you. But you must understand, the life I have now is not one I can leave. My path has changed forever." Maggie pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears sliding down her sun-bronzed cheeks. "You're alive. You're safe. That's all I ever prayed for." Amy's smile deepened. "And I carry you in my heart, though always. Do not grieve for me. Instead, live, build, protect your world, as I have found mine." Her image flickered, the light dimming, but her voice lingered like a hymn. "Know this, Maggie. We are not alone. The universe is wide, and it is full of kinship if we choose to see it. That is the truth I leave with you." The beam collapsed, the chamber falling into stillness once more. The symbols faded, leaving only faint warmth in the metal and the echo of Amy's joy in their hearts. Silence stretched. Maggie lowered herself onto the cold stone floor, her body shaking with both grief and relief. Jack crouched beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a gesture without words but heavy with presence. Scout pressed against them both, tail sweeping the dust, anchoring them in this impossible moment. Finally, Maggie wiped her face with her sleeve, her voice ragged but firm. "We can't tell anyone. If Sparrow Creek knows. If the government finds out." Her eyes hardened, carrying the weight of every secret she had guarded. "They'll tear this valley apart. They'll destroy everything." Jack nodded slowly. He had seen what governments did when confronted with power. Weapons, experiments, wars. They'd turn wonder into fear, and fear into fire. He looked at Maggie, her face lined with strength, and at Scout, steady as a sentinel. For the first time in years, he felt clarity. "Then we bury it. We leave it to the earth." And so they did. By dawn, they sealed the hatch, shoveling earth back into the grave until no sign of the chamber remained. The cemetery returned to silence, its gravestones once again only markers of lives gone by. Beneath them lay a secret larger than any war, any loss, a truth bound between stars and guarded by 3 souls who chose silence. In the weeks that followed, life in the valley shifted again. Jack finished his porch, added another window, and built shelves where books now rested beside the locket, closed, silent, no longer humming. Maggie returned with her quiet strength, her ranch thriving with his help. Scout ranged between them, a living thread tying their solitude together. They never spoke of the ship again, not because it was forgotten, but because it had given them something greater than proof. It had given them permission to live. Amy was alive, thriving somewhere beyond Orion's belt, her laughter echoing across a world they would never see. That was enough. The Nevada desert, once a tomb of silence, had become their sanctuary. Jack, Maggie, and Scout lived not as broken survivors, but as a small family bound by survival, a respect, and a wonder they alone carried. And under the endless stars, they accepted both the mystery and the peace it brought. The Nevada desert was quiet again. The storms had passed, the earth had hardened, and Sparrow Creek's cemetery stood untouched, its gravestones leaning beneath the endless sky. But for Jack Turner, silence no longer meant emptiness. It had become a companion, a keeper of truths too large for words. He sat on the porch of his rebuilt home, a mug of coffee warming his scarred hands, Scout lying at his boots, ears twitching in the cool dawn. Across the valley, Maggie Hart worked her ranch, her tall figure moving steadily among the fences and the animals she tended with quiet devotion. She would lift her hand sometimes, a simple wave, and Jack would nod in return. That was all they needed. Beneath the earth, deep under Sparrow Creek, a ship still slept. A vessel not of this world, its geometry etched in lines no human could follow, its hum like the heartbeat of a universe they would never fully touch. They had closed it off, buried it under shovelfuls of soil and secrecy. To the town, the cemetery was just that, a place of the dead. But to Jack, Maggie, and Scout, it was a gate that had opened once, long enough to show them a truth that would never leave. He thought of Amy often, not as a ghost, not as a tragedy, but as the young woman he had seen in that beam of light, smiling, alive, free among stars he could not name. He imagined her walking under skies with two suns, laughing where gravity bent differently, speaking with beings who saw her not as a girl, lost, but as a soul found. She had been given what so many of them sought but never grasped: peace. Jack could have told the world. He could have walked into the sheriff's office, into government halls, into the crowded noise of cities, and shattered every certainty. He could have proved they were not alone. But he had seen too much of what men did with power. In war, in peace, it never mattered. Truth became weapon, wonder became fear. No, the secret was safer here, folded into the soil of the desert, carried only by 3 hearts and guarded by silence. He ran a hand over Scout's head, the dog pressing close, amber eyes bright with the kind of knowing no words could carry. Scout had been there through it all: the locket, the mine, the storm, the ship, a bridge not just between man and woman, but between the past they bore and the mystery they had accepted. Jack raised his eyes to the dawn. The sky blushed pink over the mountains, light spilling into the valley like a benediction. Somewhere out there, Amy was looking at a different sky, living a life none of them could imagine. And somehow, that made this silence easier to bear. He took a slow sip of coffee, exhaled, and let the weight of years slip into the morning air. Some secrets, he murmured, voice low, aren't meant for the world, just for those who can keep them. Scout thumped his tail. Maggie's hammer rang in the distance, and the Nevada desert, vast and eternal, held its breath, guardian of a truth that would never be written in history books, but lived quietly in the lives of 3 souls who had chosen trust, survival, and wonder. Sometimes the greatest truths are not written in books or shouted to the world. They live quietly in the loyalty of a dog, the strength of a neighbor, and the courage to keep a secret. If this story touched your heart, share it with a friend. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, mystery, and faith.